Welcome to the German Historical Institute's Text Mining for Historians course with Dr. Luke Blaxell of the University of Oxford and Dr. Caspar Bielen of the Turing Institute. In this first unit, I'm going to be introducing text mining, asking what is it, where did it come from, and what can historians use it to do? The term text mining has become quite widespread in the last few years. However, these techniques have a long history and are sometimes referred to as distant reading, electronic text analysis, or, and I think most accurately, as computational linguistics. So, what is it? Well, text mining is essentially the computational analysis of corpora. Now, corpora is the plural of corpus. And a corpus is simply a collection of digital text which has been deliberately designed for analysis. This is not the same simply as a textual repository or a textual archive. A corpus is quite deliberate in its construction, and how you select texts, collect them, and actually assemble the corpus will be the subject of the second unit. Now, text mining analysis itself, using computers to analyze these corpora, can take a number of forms, but essentially they revolve around counting and finding associations between patterns of words. They are another means of reading a text. Just as we as human researchers read texts, make sense of them, a computer can enable a different way of looking at a text, a so-called distant reading rather than a close one. Now, corpus linguistics or text mining analysis can be entirely empirical, which is to say computers can automatically compare multiple texts of interest to chart noteworthy patterns for further analysis. They also, of course, can be theory-driven. Perhaps a scholar has a hunch about a textual phenomenon or something that might occur in language and wants to investigate that with a corpus. Text mining can also work, perhaps most famously, with large texts that are too large to be physically read, or indeed small ones, simply by allowing the data to be analysed in a different way. Examples of common text mining techniques, which we'll come to in particular in the third unit on this course, are things like word frequency scores, keywords in contexts, collocation analysis, and finding keywords through reference corpus comparisons. But there are other much more sophisticated techniques like topic models, timelines, and machine learning analysis. Now, the academic background to text mining in history is, I think, very interesting and really quite involved. Its origin point is usually credited to Father Roberto Bucer, who began the first computational analysis of corpora in the late 1940s, when he created a machine-readable databank of the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Father Bucer was a pioneer and, like many pioneers, was rather ahead of his time. But in the 1960s, computers became much more powerful and indeed much more fashionable across many academic disciplines, including in history. We saw in the 1960s and the 1970s a number of very interesting, very large and very expensive computational history projects. For example, looking at mass trends of migration, demographics, economic movements. One project, for example, tried to look at migration patterns to analyze the truth of the American dream. Another looked at alliance aggregations to see if computers could predict the outcomes of peace negotiation settlements. Another very controversial project looked at shipping records to analyze the slave trade, looking at the dietary patterns of slaves, the degree of breakup of slave families, and also even the punishment of slaves. Now, many of these projects try to answer very large macroscopic questions, and the aim of being able to use computing to write a total history, to build huge models, come up with large macroscopic explanations which might explain social, political, or economic history concepts was very much in vogue. Now, the profession famously fell out of love with this approach and the use of computers within it in the 1980s, but a very important flashpoint was the publication by the historian Lawrence Stone, who had famously been a pioneer of quantitative methods himself, called The Revival of the Narrative in 1979. Now, in this, Stone argued, not least that the computational projects had produced very little other than huge piles of stamped cards and statistics compiled to 4 decimal places, but also that the profession was losing sight of the human story at the heart of all history, and Stone called for a revival of the narrative. Now, although it wasn't Stone who began this, because Stone was no postmodernist, certainly the 1980s featured a considerable advance of historians who were very interested in language, but were not interested in looking at language computationally. Really quite the reverse. Deconstructing meta-narratives, close readings, a fine-grained appreciation of the contested meanings, even of different terms, let alone different texts, in their precise linguistic context. Now, even though the mega projects of the 60s and 70s were not corpus linguistics projects, they were simply quantitative history projects looking at things that were perhaps easier to count, the similarity that the still emerging discipline of corpus linguistics had with those old mega projects made historians of the day who were interested in language understandably very reluctant to dip into another discipline to see what this latest computational offering, this time involving the systemized computational study of language, had to offer. Now, in many ways, that is the situation that has predominated in the field of history since the 1980s and generally still applies today in many respects. And many of those same arguments that were used against computational history in general, some of them which lent on Stone and others which were developed by post-structuralists in the 1980s, are still very much ones that are popular. Now, of course, the next part of the story is really when computers begin to change. This is something that we've all seen in our own lifetimes. Really, since the mid-1990s and then into the noughties, computational power, even of home desktop computers, has been rapidly increasing. So it's possible to do the kind of textual analysis that Father Buser would have literally needed rooms full of computing stacks to do, even on a tiny laptop. There is also, and perhaps more significantly even than the escalation of computing power, the march of digitization. And since the millennium, huge numbers of historical texts have become available digitally, especially from the field of modern history. Newspapers, parliamentary proceedings, official proceedings of all kinds, and now increasingly even handwritten documents which aren't necessarily part of the formal printed historical record. Thus, the power of computers to perform analysis is hugely greater than it was before, and the number of machine-readable digital texts is thus much greater than it ever was before. Thus, the opportunity to use text mining and the tools to do it are very much there in a way they certainly weren't there in the 1980s. And the fact that this kind of work can be attempted so much more easily and conveniently now than it used to be is probably one of the principal reasons why there has been a new surge in interest, or a real awakening of the interest in what are actually surprisingly old techniques. The way I would describe the situation now in regards to text mining, in history certainly, is that of a very fractured academic landscape. We have the digital humanities, which consists not just of text mining, of course, but all sorts of dynamic computational analyses, visualizations, archival collecting, heritage, and all sorts of things that discipline captures. There is also the discipline of data science, harder data analysis, corpus linguistics, of course, the computational study of language by people who are interested in language for language's sake. There is then, I suppose, the relatively small number of historians who call themselves digital historians. If you want to read a strong evocation of the power and utility of digital history, Cambridge University's History Manifesto by Joe Goldie and David Armitage of a few years ago is an important place to start. But certainly digital historians are undoubtedly at the margins of the field, at least for the time being. So while this academic background doesn't provide by any means comprehensive tools, resources and guidance for scholars to begin to use text mining in history, obviously something we're trying to redress as far as we can in this course, there is nonetheless a large number of opportunities to use these techniques in existing historical debates where they haven't been used before. And in some historical debates, it may prove that they are not very useful. In others, it may prove that they are very useful. But I would certainly argue that the second coming of text mining in history is not a flash in the pan, and scholars who do learn these techniques and do try to use them to make historical interventions could be on to something good. So why might historians use text mining techniques? I'm just briefly going to go through a few theoretical points. Now, what is often given as a reason is that text mining can be used to analyse enormous multi-billion word texts that are too large to physically be read by a human researcher. Now, while that argument obviously has a lot of credit to it, I think it slightly misses the point that text mining can actually be very useful when analysing texts that can be physically read. Now, that's where the arguments for macroscopic distant readings come in. We're used to the idea of using the microscope to study text, to looking at precise turns of phrase, contextualize what speakers or writers may have meant even by the use of a particular word. But what we're not so used to doing is trying to survey that language within the panorama of the whole body of discourse, looking at questions such as power, scope, typicality, the weight and throw of discourse. And these are some of the things that a distant reading through text mining can give you that a close reading through traditional qualitative analysis can't. So, these are the 5 points that I usually make when I explain the theoretical utility of corpus linguistics text mining techniques. The first of them is that the analysis of long texts by human intuition alone is of questionable reliability. That is to say that historians are inevitably drawn to the few spots of colour on a long text that seem interesting to them, that seem relevant to a preconceived idea or hypothesis, and largely ignore the dull sea of grey surrounding them. This means that even if we want to be unbiased judges of the texts, we inevitably are drawn to things that are of interest to us as humans or indeed as researchers. And what we're not very good at doing is recognizing changes in background contextual detail. This can perhaps be explained in reference to the phenomenon of the invisible gorilla, which is a psychological experiment. A man in a gorilla suit appeared in contexts where people were being asked to concentrate on something else, like for example being asked to count the number of passes that players were making with a basketball in a short film, not noticing the gorilla that walked across the screen. Now, the moral of the gorilla story is simply that we are not very good at noticing things that have not been earmarked for attention in advance. And one of the advantages of text mining is it allows us to see concepts or ideas that we are very taken with in a much wider linguistic context very easily. So we can make a much better judgment over whether what we have noticed is something very noteworthy in a quantitative sense at any rate, or whether it is less important, or whether we have perhaps missed something of even greater importance. Now, the second theoretical reason is that text mining offers the historian the opportunity to move to a slightly different evidencing paradigm than evidencing by selective quotation. What historians generally tend to do when providing evidence from speeches or writings is to provide quotations that are representative of what the historian is trying to argue. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, of course, but sometimes those quotations can be cherry-picked, which is to say that a quotation which is really not representative of the text overall can be presented as more typical than it actually is. Now, of course, there will be different views on how often cherry-picked quotations are incorrectly presented as being representative of something that they are not in historical writing. My opinion is that this practice is endemic. Obviously, text mining gives you the ability to support a linguistic argument with actual hard data. My third reason why historians might want to use text mining is verification. Now, it can be quite hard to verify a historian's expressed impression of a text without going back and reading it yourself in its original archival context, which can sometimes be not only time-consuming but physically impossible to do. The advantage here with text mining is that conclusions which are harvested from a corpus can be replicated on software, and it can be seen exactly why a historian has reached a conclusion because they can be completely explicit about their methodology and their data, and indeed what they have done can be recreated with another scholar who downloads the corpus and the same software. In this way, text mining is quite democratic, that if another scholar also is able to download the corpus and the tools to interrogate it with, they can also look at the same data and potentially intervene in the debate themselves, perhaps a little more fruitfully than by going into the archive with some other cherry-picked counter-quotations. The fourth argument is about the communication of evidence. Now, an argument that is supported by tables, graphs, and statistics can be presented precisely. This allows a historian to express exactly what they mean, making this explicit rather than ambiguous. Now, obviously, when especially quantitative judgments are given in words by descriptive adjectives, they are inherently opaque, and a historian's use of the word greatly, slightly, marginally, moderately can vary from scholar to scholar, and it can often be very useful for other scholars who are reading a historian's work if they were able to be clear in their communication of evidence and their communication of extent. This, I think, is particularly valuable when it comes to negative evidencing. Sometimes a historian may want to argue that particular language is not in the text or is very seldom in the source text. That is something that is very difficult to do or impossible to do with selective quotations. Whereas with text mining, it's possible to be able to map the entire body of the text and thus show the scarcity and paucity of the particular phenomenon under investigation. Now, the last advantage, I think, is empiricism. Now, while it's true that a historian using text mining doesn't necessarily need to be empirical, they can start with a research question or a theory in mind and then investigate it with the corpus, and of course absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But text mining offers the ability to explore textual archives in a variety of ways by making automated comparisons, for example, looking at word frequency lists. All of these things are empirical ways of working, which allow potentially interesting trends that have not been preconceived in advance to be noticed and then investigated. And that investigation could, of course, be with corpora, or it could be by traditional historical methods. But even if they are used simply as a tool of initial textual reconnaissance and then abandoned thereafter, the empirical potential of corpora does make them useful in at least that extent. Now, I should say that those arguments are, of course, coming from the pro platform, and as you might imagine, given that we are giving a course on text mining, we are obviously believers in its use. But there are arguments that are very strong that are, of course, against the use of these techniques in history. We've got some readings that are listed below, for example, by Nanzed Dar in the Journal of Critical Inquiry, that begin, although I think there's a great deal more to be said on this, to present the argument against these techniques. But certainly, given the state of the field, no final word has been had on any of these things yet, and so I very much encourage you, when you're taking the course, to make up your own mind. Now finally, I just wanted to introduce the exercise corpora which are going to be used throughout this course. Now these can all be downloaded from the downloads page on the website. They are hosted on GitHub. Now these 5 corpora are ones that we have selected from publicly available textual historical repositories, and all of the corpora have the ability to be used in our 2 computational analysis programs of choice. The first is the simple one, AncConc, and the second, the more sophisticated one, the coding language, Python. Now, these 5 corpora are, first of all, the Medical Officers of Health in London corpus from 1848 to 1972. Medical Officers of Health were appointees who were commissioned to write reports upon various aspects of the health, housing, clinical services, etc. of London boroughs. This corpus we have set up to enable comparisons between the interwar period, where there was large shift in the role of medical officers of health, especially towards clinical services, and contrast that with their Victorian role. We've also set up another comparative group to look at the role of medical officers of health in a wealthy borough, Westminster, versus a poorer borough, Poplar. And there are obviously some interesting potential historical questions to be asked there on the different public health priorities in a very rich place and a very poor place. The second of our 5 exercise corpora is the British House of Commons. Now, this is available through Hansard, the official record for the 19th and the 20th centuries, but we have chosen here to confine our analysis from 1945 to 2014. Now, we have set this corpus up to enable comparisons between male and female MPs and different political parties on one issue of debate, the issue of abortion law. The third corpus that we have for exercise is from the Heritage Made Digital project, which consists of British newspapers from 1800 to 1880. And what we have done here is created 2 sub-corpora. We have looked for the issue of slavery by finding all articles which contain the word slavery, and then also the issue of workhouses by looking for all articles containing the word workhouse. We've also subdivided these into different decades to enable comparisons, for example, of the way that the issue of slavery was treated in the first decade of the 19th century, where there were debates on the abolition of the slave trade, in the 1830s, where there were debates leading up to the abolition of slavery and the freeing of slaves, and then towards the end of the 19th century as well. The fourth of our corpora are British election manifestos. Elections from the 3 main political parties, the Conservatives, Labour and Liberal parties, from each general election from 1966 to 2019. We've set this up for comparisons between the political parties, which is a very obvious comparison group, and then between 2 different decades, the 1960s versus the 1980s. So we can try and analyse how political language has changed in these 2 key decades in the 20th century. The 5th and final corpus we have is a little different to the others. This is simply newspaper headlines from the Times newspaper from the 1960s to present day. Every newspaper headline on every day. Now, this data is presented in a much more structured format as a CSV file, and we use this for a number of other interesting analyses.